What if everything you thought you knew about one of the most powerful men in hip-hop was a lie? What if behind the platinum records, the flashy parties, the multi-million-dollar business deals, there was something rotten, something so dark that even his closest allies chose to stay silent for years? And what if that silence ended, not with a quiet admission, but with a courtroom collapse that stunned the world? That's exactly what happened when Sean Diddy Combs, the man who once branded himself untouchable, heard the words that would change his life forever. Sentenced to 50 months in prison, fined $500,000, disgraced, humiliated, stripped of the illusion of control he had built for decades. And as the gavel struck, as the sentence echoed across the hushed courtroom, Puff Diddy's body gave out. He crumbled. He fell. In that single, unforgettable moment, the myth of invincibility shattered. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. But let's slow down, because this isn't just about one man's downfall. This is about power, about silence, about how a culture can elevate someone so high that the rules no longer seem to apply, until, inevitably, gravity does its work. Think about this. How does a man go from being the king of parties, the mogul who rubbed shoulders with presidents, movie stars, and music legends, to lying on a cold courtroom floor while guards and medics rush to revive him? How does a story so glamorous end in a scene so pathetic, so tragic, so revealing? The truth is, it didn't start in that courtroom. It started years ago, behind closed doors, when the freak-off parties were whispered about in hushed tones, when women who smiled on red carpets went home bruised, broken, and terrified. It started when the people who knew, the insiders, the bodyguards, the lovers, chose silence because the money was good, the perks were better, and speaking up meant exile. And yet, here we are. The silence has broken. The victims have spoken. The mask has slipped. Now, I want you to picture this moment with me. The courtroom is packed, reporters with pens poised, cameras flashing outside the heavy wooden doors. The judge, stern and unflinching, begins to read out the sentence. 50 months. $500,000. And then, in a voice that cuts like a knife, he calls the crimes by their real names. Exploitation, coercion, violence. Every word lands like a hammer. Every syllable strips away another layer of Diddy's carefully constructed image. And as the judge finishes, there is no applause, no music, no entourage rushing to shield him. Just silence. Silence so heavy it presses down on every chest in the room. And then, he falls. Why does that matter? Because collapses like this aren't just physical. They are symbolic. They are the body saying what the mouth cannot. Guilt, fear, the crushing weight of exposure. But the bigger question, the one we cannot ignore, is this. Why did it take so long? How many women had to be silenced? How many parties had to be dismissed as just Diddy being Diddy before someone finally said enough? And what does that say about us? About the audiences who bought the albums, cheered the performances, and idolized the image without ever asking what lay beneath? Here's the uncomfortable truth. We wanted the fantasy. We wanted the shiny music videos, the champagne-soaked club nights, the idea that someone could rise from the streets to global superstardom without ever losing their soul. But behind the fantasy, the nightmare was festering. And when the nightmare finally came into the light, it was uglier than anyone imagined. And it's not just Diddy. Look at the pattern. R. Kelly, Bill Cosby, Jeffrey Epstein. Over and over, powerful men build empires on silence, on intimidation, on the suffering of others. Over and over, we see the same cycle: rise, denial, exposure, collapse. And yet, every time, we act surprised. We ask, how could this happen? But maybe the real question is, why are we still shocked? Because deep down, we know. We know fame is a mask. We know power corrupts. And we know that when men are given unchecked control, someone always pays the price. So why does this story matter right now? Because it's more than a scandal. It's a warning. It's a mirror held up to a culture that worships celebrity, excuses abuse, and lets men like Diddy operate in the shadows for decades. It's a reminder that no matter how big, how powerful, how untouchable someone seems, the truth has claws. And eventually, it catches up. And maybe that's why the image of Diddy collapsing matters so much. Because it wasn't just a man hitting the floor. It was a symbol. A symbol of arrogance brought low. A symbol of justice, however late, landing with force. A symbol of an era ending in disgrace. But let me ask you this. Do you think the collapse was only physical? Or do you think, in that moment, he realized the empire he built, the brand, the music, the fame, was gone forever? As we move through this story, you're going to hear things that shock you. Details from inside those parties. Testimonies from women who risked everything to speak out. The quiet betrayals of friends who once swore loyalty. The money trails, the industry silence, the moments when someone could have stopped him but didn't. And yes, we're going to come back to that courtroom, because what unfolded there wasn't just the end of Diddy's freedom. It was the unveiling of truths he had spent his entire life hiding. So buckle up, because this isn't just another celebrity scandal. This is the story of a fall so hard, so complete, that it will echo for years. And here's the twist. The collapse you just heard about? That wasn't the most shocking moment of the trial. What came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. Have you ever been in a room so tense that even breathing felt like a crime? That was the courtroom the moment after Diddy's body hit the ground. Some people gasped, others froze, and a few couldn't decide if they were watching a tragedy or a performance. Was this collapse genuine or calculated? That question alone could divide the world. Because remember, Diddy isn't just any man. He's a showman, a master manipulator of images, narratives, and emotions. For decades, he's controlled how the world sees him. So when he went down, clutching his chest, eyes rolling back, guards rushing to his side, was it the raw collapse of a broken man, or the final desperate act of a performer trying to salvage an ounce of sympathy? Picture the scene. The judge had just finished reading the words that would echo through headlines. 50 months imprisonment. A fine of $500,000. The silence was unbearable. Diddy, dressed immaculately as always, sharp suit, polished shoes, the aura of a mogul still intact, stood stiffly, face blank. His attorneys whispered frantically, but he ignored them. Then came the hammer blow. The acknowledgement of the testimonies. The statement that this was not indulgence, not consensual excess, but exploitation. And with each word, you could see the air leaving him, as though his carefully maintained persona was dissolving in real time. Then his knees buckled. His hand shot out, trying to steady himself on the defense table. His head dropped, sweat rolling down his temple. For a second, it looked like he might recover, that he might force himself back upright. But then, collapse. A thud so heavy that reporters scribbling on notepads jumped. The mighty Diddy, sprawled on the cold floor, powerless. Now ask yourself, was this collapse only about the sentence? Or was it about the realization that decades of carefully constructed invincibility had shattered in front of the world? Medics rushed forward. His lawyer bent down, calling his name, his voice urgent but trembling. Someone shouted for water. Guards moved to block cameras, though everyone in that room already had the image burned into their memory. Puff Diddy, the architect of his own empire, broken and small. And yet, even as paramedics worked to revive him, even as his pulse was checked and his breathing monitored, there was something in the air, a question nobody dared ask out loud. Was this collapse real? Or was it a final performance, an attempt to paint himself as a frail man crushed by a merciless system? Because let's not forget, this is the same man who has lived his entire life in front of cameras. He knows angles. He knows drama. He knows how to bend public opinion. And a collapse like this? It makes headlines. It sparks sympathy. It diverts attention from the crimes and onto the spectacle. But then again, maybe it wasn't an act. Maybe it was the body finally catching up to the mind. Decades of arrogance, abuse, cover-ups, and indulgence now slammed against the immovable wall of justice. The heart can only take so much. The mind can only lie to itself for so long. Perhaps the collapse was real, a physical manifestation of guilt finally acknowledged. Either way, one thing was certain. The courtroom was no longer just a place of justice. It was a stage. And Diddy had given the world one final act. Whether scripted or spontaneous, nobody could tell. Do you see the contradiction here? On one hand, a mogul so powerful he could silence victims for years. On the other, a man so fragile he couldn't even stand to hear his own sentence. Which was the real Diddy? The untouchable icon, or the coward exposed? The reactions inside the courtroom told their own story. Some of the victims who had testified sat frozen, their expressions a mixture of shock and something darker, vindication. Imagine carrying pain for years, telling your truth in front of the world, and then watching the man who caused it crumble. Was it justice? Or just another performance delaying real accountability? The judge didn't flinch. He didn't call for mercy. His face remained stone, his gavel resting like a weapon ready to strike again if needed. Because collapse or not, the sentence had been passed. The law doesn't soften because a man falls to the ground. Justice isn't undone by theatrics. And outside that courtroom, the news spread like wildfire. Diddy collapses after sentencing. Headlines screamed it within minutes. Social media lit up with speculation. Was he faking? Was he having a heart attack? Was this karma in action, the universe delivering its own verdict? Memes flooded in, side by side with serious commentary. Some mocked him. The king of parties can't handle the party's over. Others pitted him. This is a man at the end of his rope. But here's where the story gets darker. Because while the world debated the collapse, very few paused to ask, what about the women? What about the testimonies that had just been read aloud? What about the years of suffering? Once again, the spectacle overshadowed the substance. Diddy knew how to command attention, even in disgrace. And yet, behind the noise, something undeniable remained. He was no longer untouchable. For years, his power insulated him. For years, whispers stayed whispers. But in that courtroom, insulated or not, the truth was laid bare. His collapse was not just physical, it was symbolic. The empire had fallen. But here's the twist. While the collapse was shocking, what unfolded in the minutes after, what the judge revealed, what the victims dared to confront, what the lawyers argued, would be far more explosive than anyone imagined. Because the sentence wasn't just about jail time. It wasn't just about fines. It was about exposing the full scale of the hidden world Diddy built, brick by brick, lie by lie. And when those revelations started spilling out, even the collapse seemed small compared to the storm about to break. And that's where we head next. Because if you thought the fall was the climax, wait until you hear what the sentence really meant. What did the sentence really mean? Was it just a number, 50 months in prison, $500,000 in fines? Or was it something bigger? Something that cut deeper than steel bars and drained bank accounts? Because here's the truth. Sentences are never just about time served. They are messages, signals. They tell the world not only what a man has done, but how much society is willing or unwilling to hold him accountable. And in Diddy's case, the sentence sent shockwaves. Let's break it down. 50 months. For years and 2 months. On paper, it sounds significant. A man who once ruled the music charts, sat front row at the Grammys, and toasted billion-dollar deals would now trade champagne for prison water, private jets for barred windows, silk sheets for a thin mattress. That alone is seismic. But here's the contradiction. Some saw the punishment as too light, a slap on the wrist for decades of abuse. Others saw it as crushing, the end of a life once untouchable. So which was it? Ask yourself this. How do you measure justice when the crimes were not just about money, but about broken lives? Is 4 years enough? Or is it insulting to the women who carried scars, emotional and physical, for decades? The courtroom buzzed with that tension. Prosecutors had pushed for harsher sentencing, pointing out the systematic nature of his crimes. Defense attorneys begged for leniency, highlighting Diddy's philanthropy, his contributions to music, his supposed remorse. The judge weighed both sides, but his voice was steady as stone. 50 months. A fine of $500,000. And the acknowledgement that these acts were not indulgence, but exploitation. It wasn't just about punishing him. It was about naming the crimes for what they were. That, in many ways, was the heavier blow. Think about it. For years, Diddy had hidden behind glamour, branding his excesses as harmless entertainment. Freak-off parties, he called them, making them sound like naughty escapades instead of prisons of shame. But when the judge said the words forced participation, when he used terms like prostitution-related crimes, the mask ripped away. Suddenly, these weren't parties. They were crimes. Suddenly, Diddy wasn't a mogul. He was a predator. And here's the irony. The $500,000 fine, $500,000, once would have been pocket change for him. A single night's bar tab. A watch on his wrist. Now, that money would be clawed from an empire already collapsing. Record deals severed. Endorsements vanished. Sirach and Sean John distancing themselves. Friends turning silent. The financial hemorrhage had begun long before the gavel fell. The fine wasn't just a number. It was a nail in the coffin. But let's return to the heart of the question. Was it enough? For the women who testified, many said it wasn't. Some spoke outside the courthouse, trembling but firm, saying, "He took years from us. He took dignity. He took freedom. For years is nothing compared to what he stole." Their pain was raw, their voices filled with the weight of memories that will never fade. Yet others argued that the sentence was monumental, not because of its length, but because of who it was aimed at. A music mogul, a billionaire, a man who for decades seemed beyond the law. The symbolism of bringing him down, they said, was bigger than the time itself. And that's the paradox. The punishment was both too much and not enough. Too long for a man used to freedom, not long enough for the people he enslaved. A contradiction that leaves everyone unsettled. Now imagine being Diddy in that moment, hearing not just the time and the fine, but the dismantling of your entire persona. The judge didn't just sentence him, he redefined him. And that is a punishment far heavier than 4 years in a cell. Because what does a man like Diddy fear most? Not bars, not fines, but irrelevance. Being stripped of his myth, reduced to a cautionary tale. And the world was watching. Compare it to other fallen stars. R. Kelly got 30 years. Epstein never made it to sentencing. Harvey Weinstein, decades in prison. Diddy's 50 months suddenly looks like mercy. And yet, mercy is not how it felt in that courtroom. Because this wasn't just about matching numbers. It was about pulling back the curtain on one of the most protected men in music. The industry knew. People whispered for years. That's just Diddy being Diddy, they said. But now, the law had spoken. And when the law speaks, the echoes spread. Through studios. Through boardrooms. Through red carpets. If Diddy could fall, anyone could. Here's the twist, though. This sentence was just the beginning. Because what nobody expected was the chain reaction it triggered. Investigations waiting in the shadows suddenly lit up. Lawsuits filed quietly now burst forward. Other victims, once too afraid, found courage. The 50 months wasn't just about Diddy's time behind bars. It was a key turning in a lock that opened floodgates. And maybe that's why he collapsed. Not because of 50 months. Not because of $500,000. But because he knew this wasn't the end. It was the start of something far worse. So let me ask you, was Diddy's sentence justice? Or just the opening chapter of a reckoning that will drag others down with him? Because as the courtroom emptied that day, whispers began. Whispers that pointed not only to Diddy's crimes, but to the notorious freak-off parties themselves. And what was revealed about those nights would shake the world more than the sentence ever could. What really happened inside those so-called freak-off parties? Were they wild nights of consensual indulgence, as Diddy's defenders once claimed, or were they something far darker? Rituals of control and humiliation masquerading as entertainment? That's the question that haunted the courtroom when the testimonies spilled out. And the answers were more disturbing than anyone dared imagine. Let's start with the image. For years, the term freak-off circulated like a myth. Whispers in the industry, rumors in tabloids, the kind of thing people laughed off as just Diddy being Diddy. An eccentric mogul with too much money, too much power, and too much ego. But behind the catchy nickname was a nightmare. Women who testified described nights that blurred into horror shows. Imagine being promised luxury, protection, a glamorous lifestyle, only to find yourself trapped in a gilded cage where every door locked from the outside. The parties, they said, were not optional. They were mandatory. Invitations weren't invitations at all. They were commands. And what happened once you entered? The testimonies were chilling. Lights dimmed, music blasting, alcohol flowing. Yet beneath the surface, there was an unmistakable tension. Drugs laced into drinks. Guards at doors to keep anyone from leaving. Cameras rolling, capturing every moment, not for memories, but for leverage. Do you see the contradiction here? A man who built his empire on the idea of freedom, of rising from nothing, of hustling against the odds, creating spaces that stripped others of their freedom entirely. How does someone preach empowerment by day and enforce enslavement by night? One former girlfriend described it bluntly. It wasn't a party. It was a prison. And she wasn't alone. Several women, testifying with trembling voices, told stories of being forced into acts they never consented to, being pushed in front of crowds, being humiliated while Diddy sat like a king on his throne, watching, laughing, orchestrating. Here's the irony. Diddy sold the world on an image of family, of loyalty, of being the man who looked out for his people. Bad boy for life, he called it. But behind the closed doors of these so-called parties, loyalty meant silence. Family meant compliance. Love meant obedience. But let's dig deeper. Because these weren't random nights of excess. They were rituals. Carefully planned, carefully controlled. Witnesses described how Diddy chose who was in and who was out. How he punished those who disobeyed. How gifts and luxuries were dangled as rewards, while threats and violence loomed over anyone who resisted. And this wasn't happening in secret basements or hidden warehouses. These were mansions, hotels, spaces filled with celebrities, executives, enablers, people who saw, who knew, who said nothing. Why? Because the money was flowing. The careers were being built. And no one wanted to be the one to break the illusion. Think about that. How many stars might have witnessed these nights and turned a blind eye? How many careers were launched from rooms filled with silence? How many lives were broken so that one man's empire could thrive? One testimony described women being flown across states with no explanation, only to be dropped into what felt like a cult gathering. There were codes, rules, rituals. No one was allowed to leave without permission. And if you defied the rules, there were consequences, sometimes physical, sometimes financial, always terrifying. And here's where it gets even more disturbing. These parties weren't just about Diddy's gratification. They were about power. Absolute, crushing power. He wanted control, not companionship. He wanted obedience, not love. And the freak-offs became the stage where that obsession with domination played out. So why did it take so long for the truth to come out? Because the women were silenced. Through money, through threats, through fear, contracts disguised as NDAs, promises of ruin if they ever spoke. And for years, it worked. The world saw the glitz, the red carpets, the yachts. But behind the curtains, the women carried the weight of nightmares no one wanted to believe. Let me ask you, how many of us enabled this? How many fans laughed off the rumors, shrugged at the whispers, bought the records anyway? How often do we choose entertainment over truth? Because make no mistake, the truth was always there. Just nobody wanted to face it. And when it finally did come out, it shattered illusions. Fans who once danced to his hits now felt sickened. Industry figures scrambled to distance themselves, claiming ignorance. But the victims, the ones who lived it, they had always known. One survivor's words pierced the courtroom. Every time the world cheered him, it felt like they were cheering my pain. Think about that. Every award show, every chart-topping single, every champagne toast, all of it built on silence. All of it feeding a machine powered by the suffering of women who were too scared to speak. And that silence was profitable. Diddy wasn't just a man, he was an empire. And empires don't crumble easily. They protect themselves. With money, with lawyers, with intimidation, with lies. But in the end, truth has a way of clawing its way to the surface. The testimonies laid it bare. The freak-offs weren't harmless fun. They were crimes. They were exploitation dressed up as extravagance. They were nightmares hidden inside champagne bubbles. And yet, among the flood of testimonies, one stood out. One voice, one story, one account that silenced the courtroom and changed the tone of the entire trial. Because what she revealed was darker than anyone expected. And when she finished, even the judge had to pause. What happens when the silence finally breaks? When the women who carried pain for years step forward, not just to tell their stories, but to confront the man who caused them. That's what unfolded in Chapter 4 of this story, the women's testimonies. And it was devastating. The courtroom, already heavy with tension, became something else entirely when the first woman took the stand. Her voice shook, her hands trembled, but her words cut sharper than any lawyer's argument. She looked directly at Diddy, who by then had regained his composure after his collapse, and said, "You built an empire on our suffering, and you knew it." Imagine the impact of those words. A mogul who had been adored, feared, worshipped, reduced in an instant by the truth of one survivor. The walls of arrogance around him cracked. You could see it in his eyes, darting nervously, unable to maintain the icy mask he had worn for decades. One by one, the women testified. Some had been girlfriends, others employees, Some were barely adults when they were drawn into his world. They told stories that blurred the line between glamour and horror. Stories of being lured in with promises of fame, love, or protection, only to find themselves trapped in a cycle of control, humiliation, and abuse. Do you feel the contradiction here? The same man who told the world he was about family and loyalty was the same man these women described as a tyrant. The same man who sang about love and joy was, behind closed doors, orchestrating fear. One testimony stood out above all the others. A woman, known only by her first name in court records, recounted a night so harrowing that even the defense team struggled to interject. She said she had been taken to one of Diddy's infamous parties, thinking it would be like the glamorous gatherings she had seen in the media. Instead, she described being forced into acts in front of strangers while Diddy sat back and filmed it all. "I wasn't a guest," she said. "I was property." That word, property, hung in the air like a ghost. Property, not a woman, not a person, but something owned, controlled, discarded at will. The courtroom gasped. Even seasoned reporters who had covered dozens of celebrity trials wrote later that they had never felt the room so shaken. And here's the question. How many more nights like that went unreported? How many more women carried that same memory, locked inside them, too afraid to speak? Another woman described being flown across the country with no explanation, then dropped into what she called a nightmare disguised as luxury. She spoke of security guards who doubled as enforcers, of rooms where no one could leave without permission, of being told, "You're here because I own this moment, and I own you." And the irony? Many of these women had once defended him, out of fear, out of shame, out of survival. For years, they smiled in public, posed for photos, posted pictures on social media showing the glitter of the lifestyle, while inside they were breaking. How many times have we scrolled past those images and assumed everything was perfect, never realizing the darkness hidden in plain sight? But perhaps the most powerful testimony came not in the form of words, but in silence. One woman, shaking uncontrollably, struggled to speak. The judge offered her time. She finally managed to whisper, "He took everything from me, and I'm still here." She broke down. The courtroom broke with her. Even the jurors shifted uncomfortably, some visibly moved. And there sat Diddy, sometimes staring straight ahead, sometimes glancing at his attorneys, sometimes wiping at his face as though hiding tears, or perhaps just sweat. But whether those tears were real remorse or just another performance, no one could tell. That's the tragedy of a man who lived his life as a show. When the mask finally slips, no one knows if they're seeing the truth or just another act. Here's something most people don't realize. Testimonies like these aren't just legal tools. They're lifelines. Every time a woman speaks, she's risking ridicule, threats, even her safety. And yet, in that courtroom, they spoke anyway, because the silence had already destroyed enough lives. Do you see the bigger picture now? This wasn't just about one man. This was about a system that let him thrive. Lawyers who signed off on contracts. Bodyguards who enforced rules. Celebrities who looked away. The music industry itself, which fed off the myth of Diddy while ignoring the screams in the background. And as the testimonies piled up, the image of the untouchable mogul collapsed again. This time not physically, but symbolically. No matter how much he squirmed, no matter how polished his lawyers' arguments, the truth was undeniable. The empire wasn't just cracked. It was rotting from within. But here's the twist. As damning as these testimonies were, they were just the surface. Because while the women spoke of their pain, investigators uncovered something even bigger. A pattern, a system, a machine built to protect Diddy and bury the truth. And when those cracks widened, the fall of a mogul became inevitable. But what happens when an empire built on illusions finally comes crashing down? That's where we're heading next. The fall of a mogul. What does it look like when a mogul falls? Not just a man losing a court case, not just a brand getting tarnished, but an empire built on money, fame, and myth collapsing piece by piece until there's nothing left but rubble? That's the question hanging in the air when we talk about Diddy's downfall. Because here's the thing, Diddy wasn't just a celebrity. He was an institution. For decades, he was the definition of power in hip-hop. A mogul who made hits, launched careers, signed billion-dollar deals, and defined what it meant to make it. He wasn't just in the culture. He was the culture. And when someone like that falls, the shockwaves are massive. Let's rewind. In the 90s, Sean Combs, then Puffy, then Puff Daddy, was the golden boy of hip-hop. He turned Bad Boy Records into a powerhouse, shaping the sound of an era. Biggie Smalls, Maze, Faith Evans. Even after Biggie's death threatened to sink the label, Diddy kept it alive with his own music and relentless business moves. Can't Nobody Hold Me Down, I'll Be Missing You. Anthems that dominated radio, Billboard charts, and award shows. He was untouchable. But power is a tricky thing. The more you have, the more you believe the rules don't apply. Diddy wasn't just making music. He was building an empire. Fashion with Sean John. Drinks with Ciroc. TV with MTV's Making the Band. Every venture screamed dominance. And behind every success, the myth grew larger. Sean Combs, the man who could not fail. Do you see the contradiction already? The world saw a hustler who rose from nothing to everything. But the women in the courtroom saw something else. They saw a man who used that same power to exploit, to control, to terrorize. The public saw a mogul. The victims saw a monster. And slowly, the cracks began to show. There were whispers for years. Allegations, lawsuits, rumors in the press. But they always disappeared. Settled out of court. Buried under NDAs. Dismissed as tabloid gossip. The empire was too big to crumble. Too powerful to be challenged. Fans shrugged. Industry insiders kept quiet. And Diddy kept rising. Until he didn't. The trial didn't just expose his crimes. It pulled the curtain back on the machinery that had protected him for decades. Suddenly, executives who once praised him were silent. Companies that once lined up to work with him backed away. Sponsorships evaporated. Sean John, once a staple in fashion, became irrelevant. Ciroc, which had long been tied to his name, distanced itself. Even longtime friends in the music industry, Jay-Z, Kanye, Mary J. Blige, kept their distance. That's the irony of fame, isn't it? While you're on top, everyone wants to stand beside you. But the second you fall, the silence is deafening. And for Diddy, that silence was worse than the sentence. Imagine building an empire where your name means money, power, opportunity, and then watching that name become toxic. Imagine waking up one morning and realizing you're not the king anymore. You're the cautionary tale. Because let's be honest, people will remember the hits. They'll remember the parties, the extravagance, the celebrity romances. But from now on, those memories will be shadowed by what came out in court. Every song, every photo, every red carpet appearance will carry a new weight. People won't just see Diddy the mogul. They'll see Diddy the abuser. But here's the cruelest twist. He thought he could outrun it. He thought he could collapse in court, play the sympathy card, and maybe salvage something of his reputation. But reputations don't survive when the truth is this dark. And the fallout didn't stop with him. His companies, his business partners, even the artists once tied to him, they all felt the shockwaves. Bad Boy Records, already a shell of its former self, became radioactive. Who wanted to sign with a label tied to scandal? Who wanted to explain to fans why their money was going to a man behind bars? It's not just the end of Diddy's career. It's the end of his myth. Think about the image he sold. The man who danced in music videos in shiny suits. The man who shouted, take that, as he dominated charts. The man who made fans believe they too could climb from nothing to everything. Now that image is flipped. Instead of aspiration, he's become a warning. Proof that unchecked power always ends in destruction. And maybe that's why this fall feels so massive. Because it's not just about Diddy. It's about a culture that let him thrive. It's about an industry that looked the other way. It's about fans who ignored whispers because they love the music. His fall forces us to ask hard questions. How many other moguls are hiding behind the same walls? How many more empires are built on silence? But here's where the story takes an even darker turn. Because while the empire was crumbling in public, behind the scenes investigators were uncovering something bigger. The freak-off parties weren't just random nights of abuse. They were part of a system. A secret world of exploitation that stretched far beyond Diddy himself. And when the first threads of that network began to unravel, the fall of a mogul turned into something even more explosive. The exposure of an entire hidden world. What if Diddy's freak-off parties weren't just isolated nights of excess, but the surface of a hidden world, one that sucked in celebrities, executives, and enablers, all bound together by silence, money, and fear? What if his empire wasn't unique? but simply one branch of a much darker tree rooted deep in the entertainment industry. That's the chilling question at the heart of the secret world of celebrity exploitation. Because here's the thing, predators don't thrive alone. They thrive in ecosystems. They thrive in circles where people look the other way, where power shields itself, where everyone has something to lose if the truth comes out. And Diddy wasn't operating in a vacuum. His downfall cracked open the door to a reality many suspected, but few dared to say out loud. The music industry has its own underground world of exploitation, and Diddy was only one of its kings. Let's start with the patterns. Doesn't it sound familiar? A powerful man, a string of young women, parties that seem glamorous on the outside but are prisons behind closed doors. Rumors whispered for years but dismissed as jealousy or tabloid lies. Sound like anyone else? R. Kelly, Jeffrey Epstein, Harvey Weinstein. Over and over, the same script repeats itself. Different faces, different industries, but the same machinery. Lure, control, silence, exploit. And just like those men, Diddy surrounded himself with enablers. Security guards who doubled as jailers. Assistants who signed off on logistics. Lawyers who buried complaints under mountains of paperwork. Publicists who spun rumors into jokes. Friends who knew and laughed and did nothing. One woman testified that at a party, she tried to leave. A guard stopped her. She begged, saying she was uncomfortable, scared. The guard smirked and told her, "Nobody leaves until he says so." Now think about that. One man's word determined whether a woman could walk out of a room. That's not just power, it's absolute control. And here's where it gets darker. Because Diddy wasn't the only one in those rooms. Celebrities, athletes, industry executives, they were all there. Some participated. Some simply looked away. But silence is complicity, isn't it? How many careers were built because people chose to ignore what they saw? How many allies to women's rights posted hashtags online while staying quiet about what they witnessed in real life? This isn't conspiracy. This is pattern. Remember the Epstein case? When his flight logs revealed a string of powerful names, people gasped, not because they didn't know, but because it forced them to confront what they already suspected. Exploitation at this scale always involves more than one man. So ask yourself, if Diddy's parties were whispered about for decades, how many other stars knew? How many laughed it off as just Diddy being Diddy? How many profited from it, directly or indirectly? And the industry protected him. Why? Because he was profitable. Bad Boy Records was a powerhouse. Ciroc campaigns were everywhere. Diddy was marketable. He was the guy who could sell both rebellion and luxury in the same breath. Taking him down would have cost too much money, until finally, it cost too much to protect him. Here's the irony. The same industry that cheered him on stage is now pretending to be shocked. We had no idea, they say. But how believable is that? Do you think billion-dollar record labels, PR teams, and media giants really didn't know? Or did they just not care until the public forced them to? And it wasn't just corporations. It was individuals too. Friends, lovers, collaborators, people who posted birthday tributes online while ignoring screams behind closed doors. That's the ugliest part of exploitation. It doesn't survive without silence. Now, here's the twist that investigators revealed after his collapse in court. Diddy's empire of exploitation wasn't just about the women he controlled. It was about influence. It was about leverage. Those cameras at the freak-off parties? They weren't just for his gratification. They were insurance, blackmail, evidence he could hold over the heads of anyone who dared cross him. Think about that. How many powerful people stayed quiet because they knew their faces, their actions, their secrets were caught on tape? How many built careers because they played along, afraid of being exposed? Suddenly, Diddy wasn't just a predator. He was a puppeteer, and the strings reached further than anyone imagined. But when strings snap, puppets fall. And that's exactly what began happening after his sentencing. With Diddy gone, others started to panic. Lawyers whispered about sealed files that might soon be unsealed. Journalists dug up stories long buried. Victims who once stayed quiet began to wonder, if Diddy could fall, maybe the others could too. So here's the question for you. Was Diddy's conviction the end of a scandal, or the beginning of a reckoning that could topple others? Because the cracks in his empire exposed cracks in the industry itself. And once those cracks start widening, they don't stop. But this revelation led to another uncomfortable truth. One, that's even harder to swallow. The people who stayed silent the longest weren't strangers. They weren't executives in corner offices. They were the ones closest to him. Friends, artists, collaborators, people who owed their entire careers to him. And when their silence finally broke, the betrayal cut deeper than any headline. And that's where the story turns next, the industry's silence, and the people who let him thrive. How many people knew and said nothing? That's the haunting question echoing through the music industry now. Because Diddy didn't operate in shadows. His empire wasn't built in secret. The whispers about his freak-off parties, the rumors about women being mistreated, the questionable NDAs and sudden payouts. This was an open secret. So why did nobody stop him? The answer is simple and ugly. Silence pays. In the entertainment industry, silence is often the most valuable currency. You don't get invited to the top by exposing the ugly truths behind closed doors. You get there by keeping your mouth shut, playing the game, and letting the money flow. And for decades, Diddy was the game. He wasn't just another artist. He was the man who could make or break careers. Speak against him, and you risked being blacklisted. Stay quiet, and maybe, just maybe, he'd open the door to fortune. Think about the artists who came up under him. Maze, Faith Evans, 112, The Lox. All of them knew Diddy as the man who gave them a shot at stardom. But at what cost? The contracts were notorious. Stories of exploitation, financial, professional, personal, circulated for years. And yet, few spoke out while they were still under his thumb. Why? Because one word against him could kill your career overnight. And it wasn't just artists. Bodyguards, assistants, makeup artists, event planners. So many people worked around him, saw the truth, but said nothing. Some out of fear, some out of greed, some out of loyalty twisted into submission. Do you see the contradiction here? The same industry that prides itself on authentic voices and truth through music was built on silencing real truths. The same culture that shouted about empowerment in lyrics turned a blind eye to exploitation in real life. Let's not forget the executives. Labels, managers, PR firms, they all profited from the Diddy machine. Bad Boy Records was tied to major distributors. Concert tours filled arenas. Merchandise lined shelves. Who wanted to be the one to cut off the cash flow by raising a red flag? And when lawsuits did pop up, because they did, they were buried. Settled quietly. Signed away with checks and contracts that forced silence. Undisclosed settlements became the broom under which all the dirt was swept. But here's the irony. The industry stayed silent for decades, protecting Diddy to protect themselves. And now, after his collapse in court, those same voices suddenly cry shock. We had no idea, they say. We're appalled. Really? Or are they just scrambling to save themselves? Look at how quickly people distance themselves. Endorsements gone. Collaborations scrubbed from social media. Artists who once called him family, suddenly unfollowing him online. Do you see the pattern? Silence when he's powerful. Outrage when he's powerless. That's not morality. That's self-preservation. And maybe that's the ugliest part of this story. Not just what Diddy did, but how many let him do it. How many closed their eyes and ears because it was easier? How many justified it by saying, that's just Diddy being Diddy? But here's the twist. Once one domino falls, the rest begin to tumble. The industry's silence didn't just protect Diddy. It protected others. Other moguls. Other predators. Other secrets buried deep in recording studios and penthouse suites. And now, with Diddy gone, those secrets are at risk. Do you think this is why the silence lasted so long? Because speaking out against him would have meant pulling at a thread that could unravel the whole fabric of the industry? If one mogul falls, how many more follow? Because here's the uncomfortable truth. The industry isn't shocked by Diddy's crimes. They're terrified of what comes next. And they should be. Because the silence is breaking. And once voices rise, they don't stop. But what about the public? The fans who danced to his music, wore his clothes, bought his vodka, praised his hustle? How do they react when the man they idolized is unmasked as an abuser? That's where the story goes next, the public reaction. How does the world react when an icon crumbles? When the man who once defined the soundtrack of parties, graduations, and celebrations is suddenly exposed as a predator? The public reaction to Diddy's collapse and sentencing wasn't just loud, it was seismic. Because here's the truth, fans build legends. Without fans, there is no mogul, no empire, no myth of invincibility. And when those same fans turn, the fall feels even harder. The moment the news broke, Diddy sentenced to 50 months, collapses in court, social media erupted. Hashtags trended within minutes. Hashtag Diddy down. Hashtag justice for the victims. Hashtag the fall of Diddy. Twitter threads dissected every detail. TikTok videos dramatized his collapse. YouTubers scrambled to upload their takes. The internet had become the new courtroom, and the verdict there was swift. But here's the contradiction. Reactions weren't uniform. On one side, there was outrage. Fans who had once idolized him expressed betrayal. "He was the soundtrack of my teenage years," one viral comment read. "And now I can't even listen to his music without feeling sick." Some tore down posters, trashed merchandise, declared they'd never stream his songs again. It wasn't just disappointment, it was disgust. On the other side, there were defenders. People who refused to believe it, who claimed it was a conspiracy to tear down a successful black mogul. They said the women were lying, that the media was exaggerating, that this was just another example of the system targeting a powerful man. Memes flooded in, some mocking him, others painting him as a victim. Do you see the irony? The same man who had silenced women for years now had strangers online doing the same thing on his behalf. And then there was the middle ground, confusion. Fans who didn't know what to believe, torn between the music they loved and the man they now hated. They asked, can you separate the art from the artist? It's the same question people asked about R. Kelly, Michael Jackson, and so many others. But can you really dance to "I'll Be Missing You," knowing it was made by a man accused of destroying lives? Here's the emotional punch. For many, Diddy wasn't just music. He was hope. He was proof that you could rise from nothing to everything. He was the kid from Harlem who hustled his way into billion-dollar boardrooms. He was the dream made flesh. And now, that dream has rotted. For fans who saw themselves in his rise, the betrayal cut deeper than words. The memes told another story. Screenshots of him collapsing in court became instant internet currency. Jokes like, "Can't stop, won't stop, except in court," spread like wildfire. Cruel? Maybe, but also revealing. Because in the digital age, a collapse isn't just tragic, it's content. And that's the cruelest irony of all. For decades, Diddy commodified others' pain. Now his downfall was being commodified in the same way. But the most powerful reactions didn't come from fans. They came from survivors, the women who testified. For them, the public finally listening was vindication. Some spoke out after the sentencing, saying, "For years, nobody believed us." Now they have no choice. Imagine carrying trauma for decades, watching the world cheer for the man who hurt you, and then finally hearing people cheer for your truth instead. That shift, that moment of validation, is bigger than any sentence. Yet here's the darker twist. Public outrage burns hot, but it doesn't always burn long. Remember R. Kelly? Remember Cosby? Each scandal dominated headlines for weeks, then slowly faded, replaced by the next trending story. Will Diddy's fall be any different? Or will people move on, stream his music again in a few months, and let the cycle repeat? That's the fear, that the outrage is temporary, that justice will be remembered as spectacle, not change. But one thing is clear, the collapse of Diddy's public image is permanent. He can't recover from this. Every time his name is mentioned, it will be tied to this trial, this sentence, this collapse. His legacy, once defined by music and hustle, is now defined by shame and silence. And yet, amid the chaos of memes, outrage, and defenses, one moment cut through the noise: his apology. The words he uttered in court, the trembling voice, the so-called remorse. But was it real? Or was it just another performance in a life built on theatrics? Because if you thought the public reaction was divided, wait until you hear how his apology split the world in two. What does an apology sound like when it comes too late? When the empire has already fallen, when the victims have already spoken, when the world has already turned against you? That was the question hanging in the air as Sean Diddy Combs finally opened his mouth in court to deliver his apology. But was it remorse, or was it strategy? The moment came after hours of tension. The judge had spoken. The victims had spoken. The sentence had been handed down. And then, for the first time, Diddy himself addressed the room. His voice was lower than usual, lacking the brash confidence he was known for. He didn't swagger. He didn't smile. He didn't perform. Instead, he looked down, shoulders hunched, as though the weight of decades had finally pressed him into the ground. "I want to apologize," he said slowly, his words trembling, "for behavior I now see as sick and shameful." Sick, shameful. Words nobody ever expected to hear from a man who built his image on bravado. For years, he laughed off rumors, dismissed accusations, and projected invincibility. Now, stripped bare in front of the court, he admitted what the world already knew. The mask had been a lie. But here's the contradiction. Was he apologizing because he finally felt guilt, or because he finally felt consequences? That's the question that split the courtroom, and later, the internet. Some people leaned in, saying, at least he admitted it. At least he called it what it was. Others rolled their eyes, pointing out the timing. If he really meant it, why wait until after he was caught? Why wait until the victims had already risked everything to tell their truth? Why wait until his career, his freedom, and his reputation were already gone? Let me ask you, do you think remorse counts when it only arrives after exposure? Because that's the tragedy of apologies like this. They sound hollow, no matter how they're delivered. Diddy went on, speaking about how he had hurt the women in his life, how he had failed as a man, how he wanted forgiveness, not just from them, but from his children, his fans, and God. His voice cracked. At one point, he wiped his eyes, pausing for breath. Some in the courtroom whispered that it looked rehearsed. Others swore it looked genuine. And that's the danger of a lifetime of performance. Nobody can tell the difference anymore. When a man has spent decades crafting images, selling illusions, and performing for cameras, how do you know if the tears are real or just another mask? One victim's reaction said it all. She sat quietly, listening. When asked afterward how she felt about his apology, she said, "It's not about words. It's about what he did. He can cry all he wants. I cried for years." That statement hit harder than his entire speech. Because apologies don't erase scars. They don't return stolen years. They don't undo trauma. And yet, they are often the last card played by men like Diddy, an attempt to soften the blow, to salvage a shred of humanity, to leave the world with something other than disgrace. But here's where the apology gets even more complicated. Behind closed doors, sources claim Diddy's private words told a very different story. While he spoke of shame in court, insiders whispered that in private he raged against betrayal, called the women liars, and insisted he was being targeted because of his success. So which was real, the broken man in court, or the defiant mogul behind the scenes? Do you see the pattern? The contradiction between public remorse and private denial. The same pattern we saw with R. Kelly, Cosby, Weinstein. The courtroom tears, the press releases, the pleas for forgiveness. Always followed by whispers of arrogance, defiance, even plotting comebacks. And that's the real tragedy. Because if Diddy's apology was genuine, it should have been enough to at least show growth. But if it was just another performance, it was the most insulting one yet. An insult not just to the victims, but to anyone who believed justice meant accountability. The internet, of course, didn't hold back. Memes mocked his tears. Comment sections debated endlessly. Some fans posted, "If he really feels shame, why did he fight it for years?" Others claimed, "A man admitting shame is progress, even if late." But most agreed on one thing. The apology was too little, too late. And yet, there's one more twist. Because apologies don't just influence victims, they influence judges, parole boards, and the public record. If Diddy ever tries to appeal, if he ever pushes for early release, those words, sick and shameful, will come back. Was that the plan all along? To craft a narrative not for the victims, but for his future? That's the question nobody can shake. And while the apology divided the world, one thing was certain. The prison doors weren't swinging any wider because of his words. His life behind bars was about to begin. And what awaited him, there was a reality even more brutal than the courtroom collapse. Because if you thought the apology was dramatic, wait until you hear what his first days in prison were like. What happens when the velvet rope life of red carpets, champagne toasts, and private jets is swapped for concrete walls, metal bars, and a scratchy uniform? That's the reality Diddy faced the moment his sentence became real. The mogul who once dictated the soundtrack of a generation now had to live by a different rhythm, the rhythm of prison life. And let me tell you, the adjustment wasn't just difficult. It was brutal. The first thing stripped away wasn't his watch or his designer clothes. It was his identity. In prison, there are no moguls. There are no VIPs. There are no entourages rushing to satisfy every whim. You're not Diddy anymore. You're not Puff Daddy, P. Diddy, or Love. You're a number. Just another inmate in a system that doesn't care about your platinum records or billion-dollar deals. Imagine the shock of going from being addressed as sir or boss your entire adult life to being barked at by guards who see you as nothing more than another body to process. From the moment he stepped through intake, reality hit hard. The mugshot, the fingerprinting, the body search, the sound of doors clanging shut behind him. That's the sound most celebrities never forget. The sound that tells them there's no going back. But here's the contradiction that makes Diddy's story even sharper. For decades, he lived in excess, boasting about hustling, surviving, thriving against all odds. He sold an image of toughness, resilience, of being bad boy for life. Now, in prison, the performance didn't matter. Nobody cared about his empire. Nobody bowed to his legend. Toughness here wasn't about lyrics. It was about survival. The first days are always the hardest. New inmates are tested. The moment you arrive, other prisoners size you up. They look for weakness, for arrogance, for anything they can exploit. And Diddy, with his global fame and scandalous downfall, was a target from day one. Reports from inside said other inmates mocked him as soon as he arrived. "Can't stop, won't stop," one shouted. "Looks like you stopped." Laughter echoed through the cell block. Imagine the humiliation of being reduced to a punchline in the very environment where survival depends on respect. And then there's the paranoia. Prison is full of men with nothing to lose. For some, Diddy represented an opportunity, either to align with him for protection or to take him down for clout. Think about that. In the outside world, being near Diddy meant money, fame, and access. Inside prison, it could mean power among inmates, a boost in reputation just for confronting him. So what did he do? Sources say he tried to keep his head down at first, avoiding eye contact, avoiding confrontation. But that's almost impossible when you're him. Everyone knows your face. Everyone knows your crimes. Everyone knows you fell not just from success, but from excess. And in prison, that breeds resentment. Food was another shock. No private chefs. No Michelin-starred dinners. No luxury champagne to wash it down. Just trays of slop, mystery meat, and watery juice. For a man who once bragged about million-dollar parties, the reality of prison meals was almost too much to stomach. Literally. Some reports said he barely touched food during his first week, dropping weight quickly, not out of health, but out of sheer inability to adapt. And then, the nights. Imagine lying in a narrow bunk, fluorescent lights buzzing in the hallway, the sounds of other inmates yelling, banging, or worse. No silk sheets. No privacy. No silence. Just the hum of confinement. For someone used to sprawling mansions, the claustrophobia alone is torture. But here's the twist. The psychological pressure was worse than the physical. Diddy wasn't just living with prison rules. He was living with the knowledge that the world outside was watching his fall. Every headline, every meme, every online joke, it all followed him behind bars. And that eats at a man. Because in prison, you're cut off. No social media. No PR spin. No way to control the narrative. For someone who built an entire career on controlling image, that loss of control is the deepest cut. Now, let's ask the uncomfortable question. Do you think prison will change him? Or will it break him? Because here's the thing about men like Diddy. They're not built for submission. They're not built for silence. They're built for power, control, domination. Prison takes all of that away. Some adapt. Some crumble. Some rage against the system until it consumes them. And the whispers from inside suggest his prison journey was already off to a disturbing start. Rumors of arguments with guards. Reports of sleepless nights, paranoia, fear of being attacked. One source even said he asked to be placed in protective custody, away from the general population, terrified of retaliation from inmates who despised him. Protective custody, do you see the irony? The man who once controlled women with guards at doors now needs guards to protect him. The predator, now prey. But here's the twist you didn't see coming. Prison wasn't just stripping him of luxury. It was stripping him of money too. Because while Diddy's body was behind bars, his empire outside was crumbling faster than anyone realized. And when the money starts drying up, when lawsuits pile on, when contracts dissolve, when assets are frozen, that's when the fall turns from humiliation to total annihilation. Which brings us to the next chapter, the financial fallout. Money. For decades, Sean Diddy Combs treated it as a weapon, a shield, a magic wand that could buy silence, buy loyalty, buy freedom. But what happens when the very thing that built your empire begins to slip away, dollar by dollar, deal by deal, until even your fortune becomes a cage closing in on you? That's the story of Diddy's financial fallout. Because prison isn't just about bars and guards. It's about isolation from your empire. And while he sat in his cell, the empire he built outside began to crumble faster than even his critics expected. Let's start with the fine. $500,000, $500,000. For most people, that's life-changing money. For Diddy, once upon a time, it was nothing. A single watch, a night's bar tab at one of his infamous parties. But now, that fine wasn't just a punishment. It was a signal, a warning that more was coming. Because $500,000 is pocket change compared to what he's about to lose. The lawsuits started piling in. Civil suits from victims. Women who had stayed quiet for years now emboldened by his conviction, ready to take their stories to court. Each one demanding millions in damages. Each one backed by lawyers who smelled blood in the water. Remember what happened to Bill Cosby? Harvey Weinstein? The lawsuits didn't just dent their fortunes, they dismantled them. And Diddy's empire was already on shaky ground before this trial even began. Bad Boy Records, once a juggernaut, was practically a ghost ship by the time he went down. Most of its stars had long since left, some bitter, some broken, some just moving on. The label had been running on fumes, with Diddy himself as the brand more than the music. Now, who would want to sign with a label tainted by scandal? Who would want to release records under the shadow of exploitation? Then there's Sean John, his fashion line. Once the height of urban cool, sold in malls across America, worn by stars on magazine covers. But fashion is fickle, and even before the trial, Sean John was struggling. Lawsuits, bankruptcies, buybacks, it was already a mess. The conviction sealed its fate. Retailers cut ties. Inventory sat unsold. The brand became toxic overnight. And then, Ciroc, his crown jewel in business. The vodka brand he'd tied himself to for years, building its image alongside his own. Ciroc boys, he'd call them, positioning himself as the face of luxury drinking. But when he collapsed in court, Ciroc executives moved quickly, distancing statements, marketing pivots, quietly phasing his name out. Because who wants their brand ambassador to also be a convicted predator? That's not luxury, it's poison. Do you see the irony? The man who once turned brands into gold was now turning them into ash. And it didn't stop there. Endorsements vanished. Partnerships dissolved. Even television deals, shows, documentaries, projects in development were pulled. Studios and networks don't gamble on scandal. They cut their losses and move on. But here's where it gets even more devastating. While his businesses collapsed, his expenses didn't. Lawsuits cost money. Lawyers cost money. Settlements cost money. Maintaining even a semblance of his old life for his children, his properties, his image, costs money. And with income streams drying up, the empire shifted from self-sustaining machine to financial black hole. Reports began circulating of frozen accounts, of investors pulling out, of staff being laid off. For a man who once boasted about billion-dollar status, the cracks in the facade grew wider every day. And here's the cruelest twist. For years, Diddy used money to silence people, to buy NDAs, to settle quietly, to erase problems before they became headlines. But once the dam burst, no amount of money could plug it. The women didn't want hush money anymore. They wanted justice. They wanted truth. And the courts weren't interested in his checks. They were interested in accountability. So the very tool that had protected him became useless. And imagine the psychological toll of that. A man who believed money could solve anything now realizing it solves nothing. No check can erase a criminal record. No luxury can erase a guilty verdict. No settlement can erase a public collapse. But let's not forget, financial fallout isn't just about the man. It's about everyone around him. His employees, his partners, his family. They all depended on the empire too. And as it crumbled, they faced ruin with him. Suddenly, the empire wasn't just his dream. It was their nightmare. And maybe that's why the betrayal started. Because when money dries up, Loyalty dries up with it. Friends turn. Business partners disappear. Even family members start to distance themselves. And for Diddy, the betrayals cut deeper than the financial losses. Because some of the people he trusted most, the ones who